Hey everyone, a quick note before we begin. This episode was originally recorded in the spring of 2021, and it was published by HowlRound Theatre Commons on November 10th, 2021. Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. Theater artists from Shakespeare to Sondheim have looked to ancient Roman comedy as a model. But the world of Roman playwrights such as Plautus was a grim one, characterized by constant violence and the omnipresent institution of slavery. How can we square this ugly legacy with the long-term influence of the plays that came out of such a world? Professor Amy Richlin has been exploring this question, most notably in her book Slave Theater in the Roman Republic, Plautus and Popular Comedy. Professor Richlin is a professor of classics at UCLA who's written extensively about what she calls outgroups and muted groups in the Roman Empire. And she's also translated a number of plays by Plautus. She won the Society of Classical Studies Goodwin Prize in 2018 for this book, Slave Theater. And today we're lucky to have her as a guest on the show. Amy, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
Your book contends that slaves in the ancient Roman Republic, quote, I'm quoting directly here, went to the theater and that their experiences shaped the early palliata, which primarily addressed slaves, freed slaves, and the poor. So before we dig into that argument and a little bit about what it means, could you please give us a little bit of context, just starting with what the word palliata means?
Okay. The word palliata means dressed in the pallium. Big help that is. So the pallium was a kind of a poncho, like what I'm wearing now, that was worn by Greeks. This is a form of Greek dress and would have been seen as such. And there's a pervading fiction in the plays that they are set in Greece and the characters have Greek names, and this is all about Greece. But the scholar Adrian Gratwick memorably said, and everybody echoes this, that the plays are really set in what he calls Plautinopolis. And I would push that a little further and say that the plays are set in Rome. They were performed in Rome, and everybody, it was outside, and people were like sitting on benches in front of this temporary stage that was put up somewhere in the city, and all around them they could see Rome. And Rome very often pushes its head up through the words of the play. So it's kind of set in Greece with a big wink. It's not really Greece. But this Greek outfit kind of let the actors get away with saying a lot of things that they're not talking about Rome, they're talking about Greece. So this is a fiction that is played with and thrown up in the air and juggled with all throughout the plays. And it's a lot of fun. So furthermore, not only is there a running joke in the plays about where they're actually being performed, and what Gratwick meant by Plautinopolis, or sometimes Plautopolis, is that they're being performed nowhere. They're being performed in Fantasyland. And I think that's very, very misleading, because these plays often make topical political critiques of what's going on in, let's say, in central Italy. Because I don't think these plays were only performed in Rome. I think that the actors toured around to various cities in central Italy, and it's just for obvious reasons that we have them associated with the city of Rome itself. Because, for example, Rome's next door very powerful ally, Praeneste, that we don't have Praenestine literature, we have Roman literature. So the plays are full of topical allusions to what's going on in these cities. Also, there's another running joke in which the actors talk about where they are as Barbaria, that is barbarian land. And this is what the Jamaican writer Michelle Cliff memorably called claiming an identity they taught me to despise. Because Greeks in this period thought of Italy and the West as barbarian land, just as the Greeks thought people who didn't speak Greek were barbarians. And there is a major reclaiming of that barbarian status of Latin as a language by the speakers in these plays. And I think it's probably exclusively slaves who talk about themselves as barbarians or about performers as barbarians or speak of themselves as being in barbaria. And they don't mean to put themselves down. They are joking about other people's tendency to put them down. From a top-down perspective, what does this mean? Rome in the 200s BC wasn't yet a world power. And if anything, the Hellenizing of the Roman upper classes was at this point still aspirational. They weren't players on the international literary scene, or their whatever it was they wanted to write or be they would not have been recognized as any great shakes in Greece, which was still very much occupied with its own personal meltdown. So I think that this is tied in with the slave trade and the fact that a lot of the slaves that the Romans were taking were Greek speaking, because Greek was what was spoken in the south of Italy. So Rome as yet was still a central Italian power, reaching out to clobber various non-Latin speaking groups within the peninsula of Italy, and now increasingly with its great nemesis, Carthage, just across the Mediterranean, which spoke a Semitic language. So you see a multilingual cultural clash here. So the fact that this form of drama was dressed in the pallium, was the palliata, is really, really a complicated phenomenon. And in the book, I used the palliata as shorthand to mean early Roman comedy as written by Plautus and his earlier contemporaries. So, and it's a term of art used by experts in the field, but yeah, it is kind of confused. It's not a term in common usage.
This world that you describe, these different sort of competing political entities and cultures within this world, as you write, slavery is this sort of constant presence. How did slavery function in the Roman world at this time?
Okay, it wasn't a Roman world, and I don't think that only really people who were living in the city of Rome itself would have described it that way. I always start with Alexander the Great, who memorably died in the memorable year 323. Alexander's death cast a deep, deep shadow over the whole Mediterranean basin. As soon as the first thing Alexander did was completely steamroller the Greek city-state system in Greece itself. And then he marched through Asia Minor, which was very heavily Greek, and not to mention Persia and points east of there. He famously got to India. But the main thing is that when he died very young, he left the Eastern Mediterranean in the power of three of his successors, and they immediately fell to making war on each other. And so the whole Eastern Mediterranean is thrown into turmoil. And this has repercussions that soak into the West or reach out to the Western Mediterranean. But the main thing that war did in that period and throughout antiquity is lead to incidents of mass enslavement, because when a city was taken, they would essentially take all the men of fighting age out and shoot them. Or if they were not soldiers, but say just craftsmen and slaves, they would keep those. And then the women and children were all raped, and then they were enslaved, and they were marched off as slaves. There are harrowing descriptions of this from all over the Mediterranean, again, in this period and through late antiquity. And the Greeks did it to each other happily. Some cities had pacts between them where they wouldn't do it. But the Romans, meanwhile, in the Italian peninsula, were one of a number of powerful city-states, including Tarentum in the south, Praeneste, their neighbor, and some other southern Italian cities. Well, they made war no differently. And they would take slaves. But the real difference comes in when the Romans fought Carthage for the first time in the First Punic War. And there were mass enslavements on the shores of North Africa of like 10,000 people at a time. And these people would then be divided up, and some of them would be brought by, they were usually sold near the point at which they'd been captured. And then they would be like slave traders would take them and sell them, but a lot of them were sold into central Italy. And so you have an enormous demographic change within the Italian peninsula itself as all these slaves come into the market from North Africa as well as from southern Italy. When the Romans finally took Tarentum, which was this huge wealthy city in the south of Italy. So those people were all Greek speaking, but then people from the countryside around there and from, say, around Pompeii spoke Oscan, a different language. And it's just like a huge mishmash of people. And then also due to war, people were not only enslaved, but if they could get away, they were separated from their homes anyway. They were made nationless. They had to find refuge somewhere. They became refugees, basically. So the roads, you can imagine the roads be crowded with groups of people just walking along with their possessions, just what they could carry, because often those were the terms of the defeat of a city after a siege. When the city surrendered, the people were sometimes let go just with what they could carry. So all the pictures you've ever seen of people walking down the road like that, these so-called caravans from Central America or anywhere in the world, just carrying what they could take, the things that meant most to them, with their children, leading their children by the hand. It would have been a common sight on those roads. Displaced peoples, that's what I was thinking about, displaced populations. So within Italy, some of them would have gone to Rome where they might have relatives or some hope of maybe finding somebody else who'd been lost. Then what really, really chops things up in Italy is the Second Punic War, the second war with Carthage, which started only about 20 years after the first one was over. And that it was during the Second Punic War that Plautus's plays first began to be produced. And during that war, Hannibal invaded Italy, and he and his troops were in the peninsula for 15 years, which, as I like to use an analogy, that's 3 times as long as the Nazis were in France. So it must have had a major effect on the population due to rape.
So out of these just horrifying experiences, you get these plays, which, as we've said, your book explores how those plays were shaped by the experiences of these people who have gone through these horrible, traumatic things, who had, in many cases, been enslaved. How did that come about, and what do the plays tell us about what it was like to be a slave at this time?
One of the things I'm trying to counter is this image that was propagated by Eric Siegel with the best of intentions. He analyzed these plays as Saturnalian, as part of a kind of carnival atmosphere with these happy slaves who don't want to be freed, who say in the plays they don't want to be freed. That is in fact not true. There are a couple of places where people say that, but in context, it really doesn't mean that they don't want to be free. Whereas many, many times slaves express an ardent desire on stage to be free. So how does it relate to slaves' experiences? I believe very much that people joke about what they're afraid of, and they make jokes in comedy sometimes like whistling in the dark, to keep. Well, I had a graphic illustration of it this spring when I was teaching comedy this past spring as the country locked down, and I had a class full of senior theater majors, and their hearts were just broken by what happened. They lost all the things they've been looking forward to, all their hopes and dreams. They had to give them up. And comedy, for some of them, was a way that they could start to get back on their feet. And one of the projects, the final projects for the course, If you wanted to, for the theater majors, you could stage a scene. And they're like, how can we stage a scene? And this is like the very beginning of people trying to stage things on Zoom. And I had a couple of students do a kind of IM back and forth of one of the scenes from one of Plautus's plays. It's kind of a very small to very big comparison of what the making of this comedy was like. So for people who had lost everything, this comedy grew up. It was made out of the plot lines of Greek comedy of several generations earlier. When I first started working on this, I thought of the movie Kiss of the Spider Woman, where the main character is in prison and he tells his cellmate the plot of a movie called Kiss of the Spider Woman as he remembers it. And they use this drama as a way of keeping their act together when under the face of terrible brutality and misery. And I personally think that this borrowing of the Greek plot lines was similar to the borrowing of the screenplay of Kiss of the Spider Woman, the story. So fine, they got the framework from these plays, but the Plautus plays feel nothing like those plays. Or you can see they're related, but they're being used for different, just because the cultural circumstances were completely different. They were playing for, I think, on a regular basis, whatever audience they could pick up in a town. I don't think that they just performed these plays for festivals. They had to eat, I think they performed them year round, and that the best ones got picked up by the state authorities in some rich city to perform at the festival. So they're performing for crowds. They had a temporary stage, which they carted around with them in a cart, and the people sat on benches. They didn't have a rake, because in central Italy, there were no stone theaters in this period. This isn't allowed by the higher ups in the state until 150 years after this time, more, because they thought it was conducive to uprisings. They thought that it's in the theater that these things get started. So they didn't want to have a stone theater there. So these troops are schlepping around. They themselves were low status. Actors didn't have any prestige in central Italy in this time. That came, again, much later, actually about the same time as they started to build stone theaters. It took the Roman state a while to kind of glom onto the idea of, actors, celebrities. That was a Greek thing, and it was a big Greek thing. In Greece, an actor was a big shot. They were called the companions of Dionysus. They went from city to city, and they would get inscriptions in their honor and the freedom of the keys to the city. And also this is heavily attested, and it's fascinating. It goes really far east into what's now Iran and Iraq. The Greek players were there. But in the Western Mediterranean, not so much, and especially not in the Latin-speaking part of it. So at this time, these are ragtag troops of players, and some of them were clearly slaves, because there's jokes about that in the plays. So they're probably not all enslaved. Maybe some of them were freed slaves. And some of the actors owned some of the other actors. And then in the audience are sitting whoever would come to hear them. They would pass the hat if they were like contemporary Greek street performance, about which we do have a tiny shred of evidence about passing the hat. But I saw a group very much like this at the Renaissance Fair in Michigan a couple of autumns ago, not this past one. And I interviewed the troupe leader afterwards, because I thought, I am seeing what existed then. So one of the things we can tell also from the jokes in the plays is that this is comedy from below. The jokes that are made are jokes that are really about ordinary people. They don't have a rich person's perspective, au contraire. So they are critical of the upper classes, and especially critical of slave owners, especially of mean slave owners.
Yeah, I'm really interested in that idea, because I think plays by playwrights like Plautus kind of get lumped in with this larger idea that this is the sort of cultural historical legacy of the winners, the old cliche about history is always written by the winners. It sounds like from what you're saying, they were performed by and possibly written by and performed for people who were really close to the bottom of society. I'm just curious. I mean, why does that matter? Why does that sort of reorient what we've traditionally thought about these plays?
Well, there's no doubt in my mind at all that the writers were also lower class. It's pretty clear that Plautus himself, and I say brackets, Plautus, or any one of these playwrights, because there were two before him, particularly a guy named Naevius, who was a Roman citizen, that they also acted in the plays, which again, at the time was a pretty lowly thing to do. So there isn't really a bright line between the playwright and the actors. And actually, what really got me started on this was there's a great historian of early Roman comedy, C.W. Marshall. And in the final chapter of his book, Stagecraft and Performance of Roman Comedy, he talks about how improv played a part in what was going on stage. That is, to what degree were these plays scripted? And he himself, he's a equity actor himself, and he has done some work in improv. And he points to places in the play where you can see that improv is going on, or what I call shtick. Well, but what everybody calls shtick. But it's just like shtick in burlesque, where there's, I don't know if you've read any of the histories of burlesque, but they had like kind of scenario books, frameworks, and then for an old seasoned comedian, there was all kinds of shtick that you could plug into these different plot lines and old jokes where you go back and forth. And there's a lot of that. There's runs of shtick in Plautus. I have an article called The Traffic in Shtick about the circulation of these jokes around the Mediterranean, because some of these jokes you do find in Greek. Some of them go back to Aristophanes, and I'm sure predate him. And you find some actually in Egypt, in Alexandria, around 270, which is about, say, 40, 50 years before Plautus gets going. So you can see these jokes kind of circulating around the Mediterranean. Anyway, but the big thing was once he said that they were improvising on stage, I thought, wait a minute, this is slave theater, because some of the actors were slaves. And if the troupe as a whole was participating in the making and the fabric of these plays, then, this is really generated from this pretty low place on the social order. Now, people have a tendency to lump all ancient writers together as somehow upper class. And in fact, there aren't that many upper class writers from antiquity at all. When you think about it, how many aristocrats really, have taken up the pen of a professional writer? That's a big question. In any case, in this period, the answer is basically maybe one, a historian. But at this point, the aristocrats didn't write. They had people to do that for them. So it wasn't even an upper class thing. But was it backed by the upper class? Signs point to no. Later, only less than 100 years later, Terence comes along, himself probably a freed slave. He had a patron. Plautus did not have a patron. Naevius did not have a patron. These guys are just free-floating crumbs in the history, floating down the history river. They didn't have a patron, and so little is known about them that for each of them, there's really only one short biographical paragraph floating around, also in the Ancient Soup of Biography. Most people don't believe that these are real biographies, although I don't myself see anything much to any reason why it couldn't be real. So, and it locates Plautus as somebody who started out, he was working as an actor, he was working on stage, and then he lost all the money that he had, and so much so that he had to go to work at a mill, a grain mill, which was very, very, very low labor and something that was also used as a slave punishment. And then the story is that while he was working in the mill, he wrote 2 plays, and then he gradually recouped and went on to fame and fortune. And then it's thought that he came from Sarsina in Umbria, which is the back of beyond. It's like saying he came from East Nebo in Wyoming. It was a wild place in northern Italy where they also didn't speak Latin. They spoke Umbrian. And so Latin would have been his second language. And that was true of a lot of the few people that we know of in the early theater. There's a sketchy biographical information, and also Latin was not their first language. One of my favorite ones, Caecilius Statius, who was a little younger than Plautus, he's supposed to have been a Celt from northern Italy. The story goes that he was an Insubrian Gaul. That is, he was one of these Gaulish tribes that fought the Romans tooth and nail in the Po River Valley up around Milan, and that he came from there. He came from up there and somehow made his way down to Rome and became a comic playwright. This is the kind of story, and maybe I'm projecting then, but that we're familiar with from the theater. The kid from nowhere who slams the door on his way out of the house and says, I'm going to the big city to make my fortune, and occasionally does. Plautus's name, in fact, is just a silly stage name that he must have made up for himself. His name means, as I've translated it, so is Titus Macius Plautus, which translates to Dick Harpo Clown Shoes. So I don't think that was his actual name. Just a guess here. So it's comedy from below. At this point, there was also, it exists, but only in fragments. So people don't really know about it or read it. You can't read it. At this point, there was also tragedy. And at these big festivals, there were horse races. So the aristocrats who were funding these festivals, they were into the tragedy, apparently, and to some degree. But everybody, like the main attraction at these festivals was the horse races. That's what people were there for. This was a sideshow. However, it very quickly, historically speaking, by 200 years later, it became recognized that it was a very valuable sideshow. And so it was preserved by scholars.
So you're painting this picture of a world where there's this kind of lower class artists to some degree, talking about sort of the intermixing the wars between the different parts of the Mediterranean world. It sounds like a kind of multicultural milieu. I'm curious too about where women fit in to this, both specifically in terms of theater, but also in how they appear in the plays, particularly with regards to women who are enslaved.
So I would just say that Central Italian culture, but certainly Rome, about which we know the most, in general, was much more co-ed than other ancient Mediterranean societies. So to have women on the streets or women present at a public festival, even very respectable women, really non-problematic. Okay, you'll sometimes hear it said that the audience was all male at the productions of ancient tragedy. It's possible that was true in Athens, which was, P.S. in parentheses, one of the most conservative Greek cities. Other cities, in fact, may not have even considered having single-sex audiences. Athens, you could believe it. Although I tend to think, yeah, there were some women there, or women standing in the back. But in central Italy, it wouldn't have been a problem for women to be present. So were they in the audience? One of the plays has a prologue. This was a common structural feature of these plays to start with a prologue. And the play Poenulus has a prologue where somebody who's in the cast, but he's not playing a role, he's just being the prologue speaker. He comes out and he gives directions to the audience. He starts bossing the audience around. And he says all these funny things. He says, no overage boy prostitutes sitting on the stage. Get out of here. And then he tells all the women, married ladies, to be quiet and stop yakking, and don't be a pain to your husbands here like you are at home. He gives a shout out to nannies, to slave nannies. Well, he doesn't say slave nannies, he just says wet nurses. But this was typically a slave position. Who are there with the little children. He says to keep the babies home or take them home, so you can nurse them. And then he addresses slaves in general, and he addresses people who get up late. And just like some acting troupe, our local acting troupe, he yells at latecomers, and he does all this stuff. So in terms of women in the audience or slaves in the audience, were they there? I think the Poinulus prologue proves conclusively that they were there. And there are a few other prologues and jokes in the plays that give shout outs to or directions to slaves who are also audience members. In addition, there are jokes inside the plays where a slave character talks about something he's seen at the theater recently. These are like meta-theatrical lines where people, and they're clearly like inside jokes for people who like to go to the theater a lot. I mean, if you work with comedians or if you try to stage comedy, it seems to me just overwhelmingly clear that you don't say no overage teenage prostitutes sitting on the stage unless you've got a couple of guys sitting on the edge of the stage who can then leap up, and move off. Maybe they're plants, okay, but there's like somebody there. Likewise, you don't, shout out to people in the audience like to be quiet unless there are. And that this is being recognized from the stage like this is one of the great delights of going to see comedy. My husband and I like to go to Cirque du Soleil, and one time a clown picked on my husband to chase around the audience. And I've really hardly ever seen my husband so delighted in his life. And he was laughing, it's wonderful. But a very distinguished scholar of Plautus, Peter Brown, who very sadly died, sometime in the recent past, which is now just a general storm of misery. Anyway, Peter Brown argues that no, these are actual literally meant commands to stay away, proving that women were not allowed to be there and slave women with little children were not allowed to be there. And all these other people who were told to leave actually were not allowed to be there. Oh, like there's a line that says, slaves, move over. If you're taking up too much room, move over and make room for the free or else pay for your freedom. And, I think this is teasing of people who are actually there. I don't think the joke is that, of course, they could not be there. But there are 2 points of view on that, just being fair about it. However, I am right. So, all right.
Well, of course.
Of course I'm right, yeah. And the other side of this question was, were there any women on stage? Probably not. So, however, this is not known for certain. It is an extrapolation based on what we know about the stage in antiquity. There's almost no evidence about who these actors were, except the hint that Plautus and a few other guys were on the stage. But it is thought that all the roles were played by male actors. And so I've written kind of extensively about drag on stage and what it meant to be an actor completely encased in a costume, which is this very voluminous costume. And then the masks were full head masks, so that your face was the only thing that showed were your ears, which for obvious reasons had to stick out of this thing so you could hear. And then, there was a big mouth hole so that your mouth could be seen inside maybe. And your hands, that would be all of you that would show, your ears and your hands. So who was underneath that costume? So it's from later periods, there are descriptions of male actors playing female and the effect that had on the audience and so on. I have written as if we knew that was true for this period, because I think that the whole phenomenon of drag on stage is doubly meaningful when some of the actors are enslaved and under the costume, you can't tell which is which. Not that you could tell who was a slave just by looking at them anyway in antiquity, since race was not a crucial part of enslavement then, although there would have been North African slaves in Rome. Well, we know of some. So they were, however, they were probably darker skinned than Central Italians, certainly than Gauls. Likewise, the Gauls, for that matter, would have stuck out. The Romans thought that Gauls were particularly stupid, and they thought their pasty skin was abnormal and weird. An indication of their low IQ, basically. So if you want a counter to whiteness, in fact, you can just look to what the Romans said about the Gauls and the Germans. You won't have to worry. White was not superior in Roman culture.
So we've got this complicated institution of slavery at the time, but in many cases the plays, as you say, are being written for, possibly by, an audience that's largely composed or has a large number of slaves in it. So what do these plays have to say about slave owners and more generally just about the institution of slavery? Are they kind of accepting of it, or are they kind of quietly revolutionary?
So slave owners play a major role in these plays. And typically these plays are taken to be about the slave owners. Although if you've seen, for example, a funny thing happened on the way to the forum, you know that Zero Mostel is the lead in the movie. And so in the play on which that movie is based, that slave is the central character. These characters are often called clever slaves, which to me sounds too much like good dog, so I think of them as central slaves. But very often what drives the plot is the slave owner's need for something. Often, but by no means always, it is the need for a pretty girl that he's in love with, that he needs either the money to buy. He's not talking about getting married. He just wants to have an exclusive sex slave. He needs the money to buy. He needs the money to lease her for a year so that some soldier doesn't get her instead. He needs to get his girlfriend away from a soldier, which was part of another play that was folded into Funny Thing. So it has, these plays have often been written about as if it was the owner's wishes that were driving the bus. However, I think that there is like a double thing going on a lot in the plays, and that very often the viewpoint that you're seeing the action from is that of the slaves over and against the owner. An easy example is Plautus's play Amphitryo, which also I think some people have seen or heard about, because it's a mythical story. It's about King Amphitryo and his wife, and how Jupiter, king of the gods, sneaks in, making himself look exactly like Amphitryo, and has sex with Amphitryo's wife. Well, the first third of the play is taken up with a verbal duel, like a rap battle, between the god Mercury, who has been transformed into the exact shape and size of Amphitryo's slave Sosia, and Sosia himself. And Sosia is the central speaker, essentially, of the first third of the play. And his viewpoint continues to pop up throughout the rest of the play. So it's like the owners are there, but to what extent are they really driving the bus? And there's 20 and a half extant plays, and you can run through them and you can say, well, Amphitryo kind of 50-50, Bacchides also kind of 50-50, and then they go up and down. Some of them a little more so, some of them less so. So kind of 2 points of view. But one of the main things that's going on is that you have many, many speeches where slaves mock their owners on stage. Sometimes slaves mock their owners to their face. And I actually made a collection of places where slaves say to their owners, "You are stupid. Nobody is as stupid as you." One slave actually says to his owner, "I've seen rocks that were smarter than you." Oh man, they say outrageous things. And in the play Asinaria, which is the play about the donkey, the title is The Play About the Donkey. In Asinaria, one slave forces his owner to beg him for something he wants. And then in order to really humiliate his owner, he climbs on the owner's back and makes him give him a horsey ride around the stage. So the owner is not exactly king, let's put it that way. And many of them are made to look like complete fools. However, right, you asked, do they just accept slavery as part of life, or is there something more subversive going on here? You'll also often hear it said that there was no real concept of abolition in antiquity. And I think that is close to true. Maybe there are some kind of utopian writers that imagine a society without slaves, but mostly even utopian writers just imagine utopia as a place where you'll have all the slaves you need, where you we'll have all the slaves you need. So who are you? That's what I wanted to say about the audience. It's made up not only of a lot of slaves, but also a lot of freed slaves. One of the remarkable things about Rome in this period, and it was commented on by Greeks, is that manumission was relatively available to city slaves, to urban slaves. If you were a field hand out in the country, you could forget about it. But in the city, there was a chance of manumission. And when a Roman slave was manumitted, he or she became a Roman citizen. And this was amazing to the Greeks. They never did any such thing. They always had a second-class citizen status. So freed slaves in the audience had experienced a real transformation. Did it keep them from owning slaves themselves? No. But I think that at least for some of them, it would have given them a really gut understanding of what it means to be a slave. And maybe they weren't like the rich owners who are skewered in these plays as being cruel and insensitive. And Sosia has a big song when he first comes on and talks about what it means to be the slave of a rich man. And he says, your owner has no idea what it means to do his beck and call. And rich men are idiots, who don't, they don't understand what they're asking for, and they don't care either. But do these slaves on stage then wish that there could be no more slavery ever? No, they do not. And when they have utopian songs like If I Were a Rich Man, okay, like the fisherman Gripus in Plautus's play Rudanes, he has a big song where he says, oh, if I get to keep this money that he's found, oh, the things that I'll do. And he says, I'll buy me a big place with lots of land. I'll buy slaves. I'll build a big house, and I'll get a ship, and I'll go trading. And I'm pretty sure that the concept of trading for him involves trading in slaves as well as in other things. So that's the answer to your question. It's not such a happy answer.
I understand. I mean, you've done a number of translations of Plautus in the past. You're currently working, I understand, on a translation of a play called Captivi, and that one really seems to have some interesting stuff to say about slavery in particular. Could you tell us a little bit about that particular play?
Yeah. Captivi is a wonderful play that I've never seen performed. I don't know of any performances of it. It completely doesn't fit the cookie cutter idea that people have about these plays. It is my great dream to see Martin McDonagh stage my translation of this play and set it in Northern Ireland, which is geographically ideal for how the play is set up. And the translation that I've written of it, it's another dream of mine, and this turns out to be surprisingly hard to engineer, to get together a group of veterans, military veterans, to help me rewrite the play into actual army slang, actual lines that actual soldiers might actually say. So I deliberately made a vanilla translation, to facilitate this transformation. This play, the setup for this play is so complicated that the prologue, I think, must have made people's heads spin, and I think intentionally so. It involves, the play begins with a backstory, and I think it's a lot clearer if you start with a backstory. So 20 years before the date of performance, so 20 years before today, there was a man who lived in Dublin, and he had two sons, and a wicked slave of his kidnapped the younger son and took him across the border to Belfast, where he sold him as a slave to a citizen of Northern Ireland. This is all set in central Greece, but geographically, I think Dublin and Belfast were intelligible. Anyway, okay. So that happened 20 years ago. Well, the kid is raised in this family as a slave, and he's set to be the companion for the son of the house. So they grow up together, and they are friends in as much as man and his slave can be friends. All right, so the two are growing up together, the son of the household and the young slave. Meanwhile, back in Dublin, the man has his older son. Well, there's war between Northern and Southern Ireland, and all three of these young men go to war together. And in a terrible battle, the older son from Dublin is taken captive in Northern Ireland. Meanwhile, the free son from Belfast is taken captive in Southern Ireland, along with his young slave. Okay, so there's a change of places. To complicate things further, when they are captured, the Northern Ireland guy and his slave decide that they're going to change identities so that the slave will be wearing the uniform of the owner and the owner will be wearing the uniform of the slave. And this is the setup. And as the play opens, you see the door of the house and two men are standing chained there before the door of the house. And that is this young Northern Ireland guy and his slave, only with their uniforms changed. And the prologue speaker makes this all clear by pointing to them, right? Inside the house lives the father of the older brother of this young slave, but he doesn't know that he has just purchased these two prisoners of war, and one of them is his own young son, whom he last saw at the age of 5. He doesn't know that, okay? He's just bought his own son. Meanwhile, his older son is up in Northern Ireland, and he wants to do a prisoner exchange to get his older son back. He just thinks his younger son is just gone. And that is the setup. And it all has to do with the two main characters, or the young man from Northern Ireland and the enslaved son. And now they're both slaves, and they go back and forth a lot about who owes what to whom. And the owner from Northern Ireland promises his slave, that in return for this noble thing that he has done by changing identities with him, that he will see to it that he gets freed. And the tension in the play is that really going to happen? Is this kid going to make good on his word? Because you're given every reason to believe in the first part of the play, when there's all this argument going on, that he is not really that trustworthy. And the slaves in the plays often say that you can't trust what an owner promises you, especially when it comes to a promise of freedom. So there's a certain amount of suspense here as to whether they're all slaves at this point, that the boy who was kidnapped, whether he will ever be recognized and freed. So I'll leave that up in the air, no spoilers. But the exchanges between the two Southern prisoners, when they're trying to figure out what they're going to do, are really, really, they're kind of gut-wrenching. Often when I talk about Plautus comedy, people say, but this doesn't sound like it's funny. But however, Captivity is Black comedy. It's very dark. That's why I'm looking for Martin McDonagh. Yeah, this is a shout out. Martin McDonagh, if you're listening, this is a great piece of material. The play title should be translated POWs. That's what it's about.
So these conclusions that you've come to in studying these works, I understand that they're perhaps a little bit different from what people have traditionally thought about who Plautus's plays are for, who they were performed or written by, what the plays have to say about the institution of slavery in ancient Rome. Have you met with any sort of disagreement over the conclusions of your book? And for those of us who aren't specialists in the field of classics, how does somebody in your field, how do you all go about sort of resolving those disagreements, those arguments?
Okay, well, I'm really happy to say, as you might suspect, different fields have different vibes. Probably this is true for any field of study or endeavor. And the people who work on Roman comedy are an extraordinary, really Roman and Greek comedy, just an extraordinarily generous, open-hearted group, because a lot of them are really into performance and into staging plays, which is a group endeavor. And I think especially when they can see that you're really interested in performance, that they're really open to talking to you, because I kind of crashed into this sideways. I started out working on the history of sexuality. So I've really only been working on Plautus for about 20 years. That's before that I did a lot of other stuff. So how do we settle anything? On the other hand, this is the Academy, like every place else, is a world where everybody's entitled to their own opinion. And everybody hopes that perhaps that their own opinion is going to carry enough weight to be generally accepted. I don't expect that my views on Plautus will be generally accepted in this generation, but I hope they will be after that. Basically, people already have committed themselves to a position on what they think was going on with these plays. And if what I say conflicts with that, they're not just going to throw up their own lifetime of work to go along with what I have to say. I think that the evidence I present in this book is pretty overwhelming. A lot of people who think that this is upper class literature, first of all, don't think about performance at all whatsoever. And second of all, they really haven't read the whole corpus of plays. And that's a lot of reading and a lot of specialized reading. And the Latin's not so easy. It is once you get going, but it's time consuming for one thing. For example, all the people who say that all of these plays are about Cinderella stories. Yes, 6 of them, 6 out of 20 are Cinderella stories, but the rest are not. Yeah, so people who are speaking on limited knowledge. But then there's some people who are just committed to the idea that all Latin literature is top down. And the great Greek historian Moses Finley said that there is nothing in Latin literature that will tell you anything about the psychology of slaves. And he included Plautus in that. And so he said, you can't look at literature to know anything except what owners thought about slaves. Finley, first of all, was a Greek historian. He just didn't know very much about Plautus. And so, I say it sounds very dismissive, but I think that my ideas are the most persuasive to people who know the most about Plautus, basically. And then there's some people who are very committed to some statements that are made by the historian Livy about who was in the audience, and they're also committed to an idea that these plays are translations of Greek literature and they belong to the aspirational wish of Roman aristocrats to be literate in Greek. And I think that the evidence for that in Livy is really, really strained. That it really does not support that argument. And I've had thrashed this out in print. Yeah, about all you can do with an idea. Now, mind you, P.S. also, I will say that a lot of what I'm arguing is non-controversial. The idea that the playwrights are all lower class, most of the reputable handbooks will just say so, even though the biographies are taken to be kind of bogus. A conservative or a kind of very solid authoritative scholar like Gesine Manuvald, she just says these are lower class performers. And also a lot of these people take the pointillist prologue seriously or comically, as it should be. So that part of it isn't really that controversial. And then on the other hand, a lot of people think that what I'm arguing is that these plays were by slaves for slaves, which is an oversimplification of what I'm saying. I want to make it clear that I think the audiences are mixed, but mainly not senators and their families. There might have been some there, but it's just like, you'll occasionally see somebody who's very rich at the stock car races, but mostly not so much.
So to kind of just wrap it up, for a big picture question here, you mentioned that you described the plots of some of these plays that deal with this context of war and slavery and violence and all these kind of horrible things, but they're comedies. And I noticed this strange tension in your book where, on the one hand, you're referencing these touchstones of 20th and 21st century humor, Monty Python, Flight of the Conchords, just a few of the references kind of sprinkled throughout the book. And then at the same time, you are, as you've said, kind of going to these comedies that are based on these really grim experiences. Does this say anything to you about the nature of humor back in Plautus's day, and by comparison, how we view what is or isn't funny today?
All right. Well, as I use a kind of mantra in the book, then something I think is very true. Jerry Seinfeld once said, "All comedy starts with anger." And Freud says as much in his, although at greater length, in his book, Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious, where he talks about the relation between jokes and hostility. And I should just add that, and I use for my students as an exemplar, Richard Pryor. And we watch a concert tape in my comedy course of Richard Pryor's. That nobody could be coming from a grimmer place than Richard Pryor came from in terms of his life, his early life, what he lived through, and the comedy that he made out of it. In this concert tape, for example, there's a long sequence where he talks about being beaten by his grandmother as a child with a switch, and you tell the kid to go out in the backyard, pick the switch, then come back in here, and she's going to hit you with the switch. He does an imitation of that. And people are laughing, people in the audience killing themselves laughing is a good parallel for the jokes that are made in Roman comedy. Well, it's not the darkest aspect of Richard Pryor's early life, let's put it that way. I mean, he was raised in a brothel. So I think that there is not such a long distance between comedians now and comedians in antiquity. We don't have the complicating factor of slavery, although we have the complicating factor of the history of slavery. And Key and Peele, for example, did a slave auction sketch, which is available on YouTube, which also is optional in my class. But I think that people laugh at what they fear, or sometimes they laugh at what they hate, and sometimes they laugh at what would otherwise make them cry. And that's what I've been trying to do with my students now, making jokes and gallows humor. There's an excellent essay by a guy with I'll just spell it out since this is going to be oral. A guy named Antony Oberdlik, Obrdlik, a sociologist who escaped from Nazi Czechoslovakia in the Second World War. And he wrote an essay called Gallows Humor, which I assigned to my students. And he talked about the jokes that people told as the Nazis were invading his country until they hit a point where it really just wasn't funny anymore. So I think that jokes and humor always do have this survival aspect to them, that they are something that people do to keep going. And I felt vindicated when a Netflix series came up, just a series of 4 episodes called Larry Charles' Dangerous World of Comedy, where he went to the most dangerous places in the world with a film crew. They were so brave. And they interviewed a warlord in Liberia, and they went to Syria, and they went to all these places that were, the streets were filled with rubble, and interviewed comedians and talked to comedians or people who were just kind of joking around in the street about what it meant to do comedy in those circumstances. And then there's a terrific episode on race in the US. My favorite part of that one was when they interviewed 3 young women from a Native American reservation in the upper Midwest who do comedy. They're aspiring comedians. Everybody speaks to an audience that first maybe is only of the people who share the same trauma, so that you can say, don't you just hate that, to people who really have experienced that. And then, like you see for Richard Pryor, actually, in the book, I talk about what I call the Richard Pryor at Long Beach phenomenon, which is this concert tape was from a concert held at Long Beach. And the camera pans over the audience. You can see that the audience has lots of white people, and they're just killing themselves laughing And to me, one of the funniest things in that routine is when he imitates a white woman, and he does like white lady voice. And I just completely lose it when he does that. And I know where it's coming from. And if he said it in prose, as it were, I wouldn't be laughing. I would be mortified. So the human psyche is a complicated thing, but I don't think it's any different or complicated in different ways now than it was then. And I think that all humor is related and helps you understand. We can understand what happened 2,000 years ago through humor, through our own experience in humor. That's what I think.
We'll post links in our show notes that will let you explore the world of ancient Roman comedy. Amy, thank you so much for joining us.
It's really been a pleasure. I'm always happy to talk to the world of the theater.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit theaterhistorypodcast.net and follow @theaterhistory on Twitter. Just a note, theater is spelled THEATRE in our website URL, and it's spelled TER at the end in our Twitter handle. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.